Hey everyone, welcome to Stronger with Time. I'm Tony Battaji. Today's conversation is with Professor Severine Lamon. Dr. Lamon is a professor at Deakin University School of Exercise and Nutritional Sciences in Melbourne, Australia. She earned her PhD at Lausanne University in Switzerland and moved to Australia to conduct her postdoctoral training. Severine is a world-leading molecular biologist who focuses her work on the regulation of skeletal muscle mass in health and disease conditions, which also includes the aging process. Her research also focuses on sex-specific muscle physiology and how the male and female muscle differentially adapt to exercise and disease conditions at the epigenetic, molecular, cellular, and functional levels. Our conversation today explores the complexities of female aging, particularly focusing on the changes in muscle mass and function as women transition through the menopause. The real highlight for me in my conversation with Dr. Lamon is the emphasis she places on the importance of individualization when we're looking at health, but especially for women navigating menopause. And she highlights the need for reliable, scientific-based health and fitness information for women as they age. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Professor Severine Lamon. Severine, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
You are a world expert and lead a lab doing research in the world of how females age, how they respond to train, and all the differences that occur pre and post menopause. So we're going to have a great discussion today looking at the changes that occur for a female from being in their mid-20s to approaching menopause to after menopause. So thanks for coming.
My absolute pleasure, Tony.
Let's look at it from the hallmarks of aging. And what most people are interested is what is happening to muscle, what's happening to bone, also what's happening to metabolism as you approach menopause and then pass menopause. So let's start from a hormonal perspective and a muscle perspective. What is going on for a female in their 20s? And then what happens as they approach menopause? And then what do we see afterwards?
Yeah, so let's look at what's happening on the functional level, because that's something that everyone can relate to in their daily life. So we know that muscle mass and function, and this is true in both males and females, peak around your 20s, mid-20s, and this is when you are the strongest and your muscle have the potential to be the biggest, right? And then once you hit 40-ish, you can see, and that's a universal consequence of aging, that there is a steady decrease in muscle mass and function. So figures could diverge a bit depending on the studies, but we're talking about anything between 4 and 10% per decade. It varies a bit whether we're talking about pure muscle mass or muscle strength, but I think it's a universal truth that past your 40s and somewhere between your 40s and your 50s, your muscle mass will start to atrophy, and as a result, your muscle function will start to decline. So now, there are things that you can do to slow down or to blunt this normal response to aging, but this is basically what we are seeing in the general population. So the muscle, and I'm a muscle physiologist, so that's my bread and butter really. I'm less versed into bones, but I can tell you that the muscle is pretty much important for everything that we do in everyday life. So it is important, obviously, for locomotion, for doing fine and gross movements. It is important for metabolism, and we'll touch on that in a minute. It is important for posture. It is important to store nutrients. And if you look at a vast arrays of diseases and conditions, you can see that the muscle is always, a loss of muscle is nearly always either a hallmark or a side effect of any chronic disease. So you look at cancer, we talk about cancer cachexia, but it's basically what it is. You look at many chronic diseases, obviously myopathies, but even diseases that we might think are less related to the muscles, such as type 2 diabetes. They are all somehow related to a loss either in muscle mass or in muscle quality and function. So basically, the bottom line is that maintaining muscle mass, and that's true for males and females alike, maintaining muscle mass as we age is the very best thing that you can do to try and age in a healthy and graceful way.
What do we see with females' muscles from, say, peak at 25 to approaching menopause? Is it a steady loss of strength and muscle, or do we see events occurring with the transition of estrogen?
So this is a really good question, and I will tell you everything I know, which is not the absolute truth, just because there hasn't been that much research. So firstly, I think we have to acknowledge what menopause is from a hormonal perspective. So as females, from the age of the first menses, we usually, most of us, cycle through a 28 or 26 to 35 day cycle across the months, which basically peaks at ovulation, which is when the female is ready to have a baby. And basically, then the hormones come down and the cycle restarts again. And that lasts for 20, 25 years, 30 years sometimes, depending on time of the first menses and time of menopause. So the two main female hormones, the ovarian hormones, are estrogen and progesterone, and actually I should say estrogens because there are several types of them. And the one we're going to talk about today mostly is E2, estradiol, because it's the one that's the most prominent during the reproductive years. And what happens at menopause is simply that these ovarian hormones, which have been cycling the whole life, basically their endogenous production, so the amount of these hormones that the body produces, starts dropping. And by the time the menopausal transition is finished, and I'll come to that again, we will be in a estrogen or E2 estradiol and progesterone deprivation state until the end of our life. So what does it mean in terms of the menopausal transition? So I think we have to be very careful when we diagnose perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause for a number of reasons. And there's been a lot of buzz in the media lately. But the first thing I'd like to remind people is that some women might feel the first symptoms of pre or perimenopause at 35, and some females might not feel anything until 50. So we cannot pin down an age for the menopausal transition. Likewise, some women will go through the menopausal transition within 5 years, and for some women, it will go up to 15 years. These are very individual things that are defined by many, many factors, including genetics, lifestyle, and lots of things. So speaking about the menopausal transition in generic terms is difficult simply because every woman is different and might experience a different transition when it comes to the symptoms she experiences, the age at which she experiences the symptoms, the length of the whole transition. So once we're happy to agree with that, it is generally accepted that this acceleration in muscle loss and function, or this normal loss in muscle mass and function that is actually quite linear in males, will accelerate in females during the menopausal transition. And this is one of the novelties of my research, where instead of grouping females, let's say, into young and an old cohort and comparing them, or trying to group them between a pre and a perimenopausal cohort, which is extremely complex for the reasons I just said. And also, I am not an obstetrician or gynecologist or an endocrinologist. So I do not diagnose menopause in females. That is not my job. So this idea of dichotomizing populations in research, I think, has actually done a lot of harm, because if you think about it, if you place people in a young or an old age group, we might have people at the borders of these groups that are actually much closer in age than the average people belonging to this group. So what's one of the things that my group has been doing is that we have been investigating these transitions over the whole lifespan. So we have recruited women from the age of 18 up to the age of 80. We have asked them to report if they had been diagnosed at pre, peri, or postmenopausal, and sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. But basically, we have taken an agnostic approach where we have measured their hormone levels, we have asked them about the symptoms, and we have done every measure of muscle mass and function in an agnostic, age-agnostic way, in an attempt to basically describe what happens over the lifespan from 18 to 80. And one of the most mind-blowing outcomes, and this is a paper that has been accepted a couple of weeks ago, and it's a bit sad that it's not online yet. I think it's going to be online in the next couple of days, is that we have looked at what is called the neuromuscular function. So basically, how well the connection between the brain and the muscle works over the lifespan. And we have found that simple measures, such as, for example, the cross-sectional area, so the size of the quadriceps muscle, in females, it decreases quite nicely and in a linear fashion. However, when you start looking at measures of the neuromuscular function, so one of them is what is called maximum voluntary contraction, which is basically the maximal force that can be generated by a group of muscles, you can see that there is a real drop, a real acceleration around that time of menopause. So between 45 and 55 years old, this decline is not linear anymore, but it's really a drop which we could match with this menopausal transition. And the same is true, for example, for the rate of torque development, which is an individual's ability to rapidly generate strength, or for voluntary activation, which is the level of voluntary drive that is required to produce muscular effort. So that was one of our best findings. Things are not linear. They do not happen in a linear way, but instead we see this real drop that we could pinpoint around the menopausal transition.
Are you the first group to have such long-term duration to assess these things?
So there are cohort studies around, don't get me wrong. I don't think there is any study that has looked in such a controlled way at such a large cohort in such details. So we have controlled our study for absolutely everything. So for example, we have calculated how much our participants slept and what their diet was and what their physical activity was, what the level of fitness was. We have obviously measured their sex hormones at different times of the study. And then we have also done something that not many groups would be in a position to do, which is we have looked at every aspect of muscle function from the top really broad physiological level, that is your muscle strength, your muscle function that I just talked about a little bit, your muscle mass, we've done medical imaging, and then we sort of went down to the more granular level. So for example, we have collected muscle biopsies because we are interested in the genetics and also the epigenetics components of what constitutes this or what influences this aging process over the lifespan. So we are certainly not the largest aging cohort, and population-based cohort can reach thousands of participants, but I think we are certainly the most controlled cohort that has taken as many precise measures of pretty much every aspect of muscle mass and function.
Super interesting. And I'm assuming that your impetus for doing this line of research is all of the work you've done in the sex hormones, looking at the differences in males and females. And you've done some really interesting work looking at both intramuscular sex hormones and circulating hormones. Do you want to give us firstly, for those of us who don't know how you do this, how are you measuring intramuscular estrogen and then obviously you're circulating estrogen? How have you done this and what have you found?
So that's a really cool question, and you'll have to re-invite me again in 2 years' time so that I can actually answer this question. So this is a little side project, little side hustle that I have, which I'm conducting with a PhD student of my group. So I had seen in the literature for the last 10 to 15 years that people had attempted to quantify the amount of testosterone that is actually found in the muscle instead of or as opposed to in the circulation. So we have to understand that testosterone as well as ovarian hormones, first thing very important, are produced in both males and females. And different synthesis sites, different amounts, different concentrations, different changes over the lifespan. But every male and female produces both testosterone, but also estrogens and progesterone. And that's important to know. And since 2015, I believe, people had attempted to actually quantify the amount of these sex hormones that is found in the muscle itself. And this follows up from an observation that a hormone is a small molecule and you will need a couple of very specific enzymes to produce them in the body. And it is known, or it has been known for a long time, that these hormones they are mostly synthesized within the testes for the males and the ovaries for the females. But these enzymes that are necessary to build up these sex hormones are also located in many other tissues, including skeletal muscle. So people had been trying, firstly, to determine how much of these hormones were actually synthesized within the muscle instead of within the genitals, and how much is it in the muscle, and what difference does it make. So we have reviewed the literature around this, and there are some associations between intramuscular sex hormones and aging and response to exercise that seem to be, or that may be, stronger than the associations with circulating sex hormones. But the main issue is that there's actually no super reliable method to measure the sex hormones in the muscle. In the blood, it's very easy. It's extremely well established. If you think about, I told you before we started to record, I did my PhD in an anti-doping laboratory. And measuring sex hormones in circulation or in urine is something that they've been doing at an extremely accurate and precise level for many, many years. So that's not a problem. But when it comes to the muscle matrix, you first have to take out a little tiny piece of muscle from someone's vastus lateralis muscle, which is the size of a grain of rice, and it's called a muscle biopsy. And it's an invasive procedure. And then you have to clean up your sample to remove everything you can from this muscle matrix to actually be able to isolate the sex hormones that you're interested in. And this is what my student Victor is attempting to do for his PhD. He is trying to adapt the gold standard, it's called LCMS, so it's mass spectrometry based measures, is super high level in terms of quantification and identification, and to adapt this method to the muscle instead, because we believe that there could be stronger associations that we have actually seen with circulating sex hormones.
Okay, so it's 2025. Where are we at with our understanding of circulating sex hormones and muscle mass and strength throughout menopause? And what are you seeing the difference between that and what we currently know, albeit limited, in intramuscular hormones?
So in terms of the circulating hormones, unfortunately, I don't think we are very far, or certainly not as far as we should be. So I have another study that is about to be published where we basically report the first muscle and hormone results from that study I did mention before. And we found a lot of really interesting associations. But something that we have to keep in mind is the difference between associations and cause and effect relationships. And I think this is something people maybe do not intuitively understand. So this study in particular that I'm talking about, and we call it the FAME study, female and muscle and exercise. I think my students came up with the acronym. So it is a cross-sectional study, meaning that we look at a given population at a given moment in time, and everything that we're going to learn from this study is going to be an association. Meaning, for example, we have found that independently of age, estrogen is positively associated with, for example, appendicular lean mass, across the lifespan. Okay, cool. So that's a result, but it is an association. In the same way, we have found that independently of age, progesterone is positively associated with percentage of body fat and appendicular lean mass across the lifespan, meaning the more of these hormones, the more appendicular lean mass across the lifespan, and that's true independently of age. So it gives us a really good indication to understand what is happening at a given point of time. What it doesn't tell us is whether there's actually a cause and effect relationship between testosterone and this given measure. And that is a critical point, because unless you're going to recruit a number of research participants and you're going to put them on a very strict and controlled estrogen treatment, which is very hard to do from an ethical perspective, and you would need a really good rationale to do that, you will never be able to assess cause and effect relationship, as in prior to the study without estrogen supplementation, this is what we observed. Post-study with estrogen supplementation, this is what we observed, and this is different from our control group. Therefore, we can absolutely confirm that estrogen is responsible for this given mechanism that we're interested in. Does that make sense?
It does make perfect sense. And you've also done similar work with testosterone, and you published a paper last year looking at total testosterone, and you've looked at indices of strength, you've looked at indices of muscle. And for what a lot of people don't realize is that testosterone is bound to a protein carrier, and there's also free testosterone. And when we have a blood test, it will often report just one thing, and that's just total testosterone. And at least in Australia, you will need to ask for the free and the androgen index. Where are we at with the work you've done and understanding the role of total and free testosterone and muscle mass?
So this study that you're referring to is interesting because we actually pushed it a little bit further to tease out cause and effect relationship. But we did not use a human model. We used a tissue culture model. So basically muscle cells that we put in culture, and then we treated them with testosterone. So that's a nice way to achieve mechanistic outcomes without having to do it on patients. But going back to your question, if you look at this particular study, you can actually see that it's been funded by a grant from the International Olympic Committee. And I want to start here because this is an issue that's been bugging me for many years. And I guess the regulations and the wording changes pretty much on a monthly basis. But when we started the study, or when we applied for the grant, which now will be nearly 8 years ago, the main issue that World Athletics and by osmosis the International Olympic Committee was dealing with was the problem of the so-called hyperandrogenic woman. And this is a very vague term because it doesn't tell us anything about the chromosomal makeup or the phenotype of this woman athletes. And by the time chromosomal testing wasn't allowed, which is something that has changed in the last few weeks. So basically, they were just dealing with this cohort of seemingly female athletes that were naturally producing high level of testosterone for whatever reason, and I'm not really interested to go into the reasons. And they basically said, okay, these females are producing too much testosterone, so we're going to draw a line. We're just going to define a threshold, if you ask me, in a semi-arbitrary way, and decide that anyone who has more than this threshold of total testosterone in the circulation at any time, any female will have to pharmacologically decrease the testosterone level in their blood to be able to participate in female competition. And coming from my muscle physiology and anti-doping background, I was like, hang on. So the assumption that you're making is that here there is a direct association or correlation between the amount of total testosterone and the performance of your muscle, which is what we're interested in the sporting context. So I started to look into the literature, and obviously there was absolutely nothing published. So I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to write a grant and submit it to the International Olympic Committee, which luckily was happy to fund it. And meanwhile, we did a couple of reviews of the literature. And by the time we actually conducted the study, we had a pretty good idea of our findings, of what we were going to find. And indeed, we found that there was absolutely no association between total testosterone levels and muscle growth and muscle function and muscle performance in females. So this is all premenopausal for that study. But the interesting bit is that, as you mentioned, testosterone appears in many forms, and we mostly hear about total testosterone, even in the anti-doping / sporting regulation world. But actually, testosterone lives bound to a carrier protein, and it must be in certain conditions to be able to be imported into the cell where it can actually do its job. And to make it's complex, but to make it simple, basically, we have to look at the amount of testosterone that is free from this binding protein. And we found that this free testosterone was actually, which is also called bioavailable, was actually maybe a bit more predictive of muscle size, muscle strength, and muscle performance than the total form was. It is not a very strong association, which means that whether an association exists, it is also compounded by many, many other factors. So testosterone is certainly not the prime determinant of muscle mass growth and performance. In females, in free testosterone might be a tiny or a little component of that complicated package that actually makes up muscle performance on the long run. To me, it reminds me, I don't know if people interested in sports will remember in the 90s, suddenly someone decided that 50% hematocrit we're going to draw a line in the sand and decide that everyone who is over 50% hematocrit cannot participate in elite cycling races. Well, to me, it's the exact same thing. This is a semi-arbitrary threshold with very, very little / no physiological evidence behind it. And sure enough, this threshold was abandoned a few years later. And I think we are in a similar case here where we have singled out this one hormone and decided that it could be the main determinant of performance in female muscle. And actually, a simple muscle physiology study can show you that it's just not the case.
And this is a great contribution because the public think testosterone, they think bodybuilders. So testosterone that a bodybuilder would take versus your own circulating testosterone is the same thing. And it's work like yours that is pointing out that we're dealing with two very different levels in the body. And this normal circulating testosterone and the free testosterone is by order of magnitude different to what they'll see bodybuilders doing.
Yeah, you're right. Because we dealt with so-called normal female participants, we had a few female participants that had high testosterone levels, but they were still within the physiological range. When we talk about testosterone doping, it's a completely different world, right? The molecule itself is pretty much the same. We can assume it's the same, and it takes very advanced technology only used in anti-doping labs to actually discriminate between the endogenous molecule and the pharmaceutical one. So from a structure and function perspective, it is the same and it does the same. Now, to your point, absolutely. When we're talking about testosterone doping, and let's go back to the 80s and think about what happened in East Germany, for example, or maybe a bit closer to us in Russia. We could see these really, really strong phenotypes of testosterone intake where you would see massive increases in muscle mass in males and females alike. You would see females developing masculinizing traits, a prominent jaw, and many other secondary sexual characteristics that are mostly attributed to males. So we are talking about two vastly different things, and I'm never going to pretend that an exogenous or pharmaceutical testosterone does not increase your muscle mass and function, because it absolutely does in both males and females.
Two follow-up questions to that, and we'll have a look at the work that you've done in performance-enhancing drugs in just a few moments. But many females post-menopause who are measuring their testosterone also notice a marked decline. The question that I'm asked most commonly is, should we be adding testosterone to hormone replacement therapy? And is this going to have a measurable effect on my muscle mass?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and actually something that I've only been made aware of in the last few weeks. So it's a very topical question. So I'm trying, you can't see me, but basically I'm frantically scrolling through my latest results, which are on my other screen. But I've got a strong suspicion that we actually did see this decline in testosterone over the last span in females, and it was very consistent. So yes, you are right. Now, whether this should be part of HRT in any form, I don't know. And I would argue that probably no one knows at this stage simply because the mechanistic evidence behind it, the research that would be able to basically assert this cause and effect relationship has not been done extensively. So from the top of my head, there are a few studies that are a few years old now, which have given testosterone to postmenopausal females. And I remember that there were some positive effects on muscle mass and function. From the top of my head, again, this was not as obvious in premenopausal females, but I think they were able to increase muscle protein synthesis to a little extent. I think the bottom line is that I could only find a couple of studies which had done that. There's probably more animal studies actually, but again, to justify such a study in human, you need a pretty strong ethical rationale behind it. And I know that some people are running this type of studies at the moment. So at this point in time, precaution principle, we don't know. We don't know to which extent this will induce masculinizing effect. We don't know to which extent it will actually have a significant effect on increasing muscle mass and function. We don't know whether this increase might be worth considering the potential side effects. So I would just exert caution before making big claims because, okay, I haven't looked at this specific literature for a couple of years, but when I did, I remember there were maximum 3 or 4 studies run in small cohorts with fairly inconclusive results. So there is a chance this is a good thing. It might be a good thing for certain females, but I don't think that the research is at a stage where we could definitely say, yeah, we absolutely need to include testosterone in HRT at this point in time.
And maybe we're coming at this from the wrong angle. And given that these circulating hormones don't appear to have a strong role, it could be that it enhances mood, or it reduces joint pain or muscle pain, and it encourages women to want to exercise more and recover faster between training sessions. And maybe that's its benefit rather than anything directly related to muscle.
I would just unpack this a little bit. So, firstly, I think sex hormones actually have a very prominent role in all of this. What I would just be careful about is to draw against mechanistic relationships between things that haven't been established yet. So the associations are there and they are very strong. What we don't know exactly is what these hormones do exactly in our tissue of interest at our time of interest. For example, one of my students, Annabelle, has written a whole review about the role of estrogen alone on skeletal muscle mass and function across aging. And there are some evidence, but there are also a lot of inconsistencies, and we have to keep that in mind. So yes, I think hormones play an enormous role in that whole process, and this is why I am running the study that I am running. However, I don't think we really understand what they do at the molecular level in our tissue of interest. And this is where the research should focus, in my opinion. Well, at least that's what I'm interested in the next few years. Now, back to your point of testosterone, yes, they could, and that is true for any aspect of HRT. It could be true for estrogen, could be true for progesterone, or can be a combination of all of these. There are positive side effects that people might be searching for, and there are also negative side effects. And I often get asked the question about HRT. Should I take it? Should I not take it? Should I combine it with exercise? And my go-to answer is it depends. And it depends on a lot of things. HRT is, again, an umbrella term. It could be estrogen only. It could be a combination of estrogen and progesterone in various doses for various time period, right? So for some women, it's going to be life-changing. For some women, they will hate it. Some women will enjoy the positive side effects without really noticing any effect on their muscle, but they might find an improvement in their mood or the other way around. And it is such an individual thing that at the end of the day, there's no one size fits all, I think, in the area of HRT. People respond in very different ways to HRT. And I think the same might be true to testosterone. If suddenly testosterone became part of a typical HRT prescription, you would have some women experiencing positive side effects, negative side effects. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the individual to decide what's best for them and for their body.
Yeah, and I think that is a public message that is often missed, is that it's not one protocol with one predictable outcome, and it might be a bit of time and trial and error to work out whether it does suit you and long enough to give it time to see change in the metrics you're interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. And also some women might need it for a short period of time. Some women might need it for the rest of their lives. And I don't think there's any judgment or any one size fits all, because there isn't. And yeah, that's a question that comes up quite a lot. And it's a bit obscure, the messaging that is given around HRT. And if you think about it, I believe that back in the 70s, where the contraceptive pill was introduced, it was probably the same, because we were still, or doctors or pharmaceutical companies were still playing up with hormonal dosage, with which combination was the right one. And we've seen that over the years, the doses of hormones that were administered to women wanting to take the contraceptive pill have decreased dramatically, and they've been optimized, and there's little to few to no side effects these days. And I think we're probably talking about similar trial and errors that will take a little bit of time and that will never suit everyone.
Let's talk about sleep. I love sleep. And
I love to sleep.
And there's been a renewed interest in the importance of sleep for our health. And there's been numbers thrown around that sleep deprivation can affect muscle strength, muscle mass, and sex hormones. And this is another area you've done work in. Can you tell us the work that you've looked at for sleep deprivation, what you've measured, what you found, and how on earth do you get subjects to voluntarily go without sleep?
Okay, I might start with that. I had a really, really good PhD student named Olivia, who was an exercise physiologist and ended up being a high performance coach in AWFL football. And she had this interest in sleep deprivation. And we thought, okay, this is going to be something different. And my colleague here had expertise in sleep, and I had expertise in muscle physiology. And we embarked into that journey of sleep depriving people, firstly for a whole night, as in 36 hours without sleeping. And then we did a 9-day sleep deprivation trial where our participants were only allowed to sleep for 5 hours. This was hard as hell, and there is no way I will ever do a sleep deprivation study again, but it was very formative and informative, I guess. So how do you get people to do that? Well, you make a lot of friends around the university, and you tell them how important the research is, and that they will not only not have any sleep for 36 hours, but they will also volunteer to give 3 pieces of muscle. Or in the case of the 9-day study, we actually incentivized them with pretty good money, which was appealing to PhD students and other students. It is hard. It requires an incredible amount of logistics, research assistants, people watching the participants at all time. Meals have to be controlled, sleep, light, physical activity, all these things have to be tightly controlled. And at the end of the day, you get fantastic results. So what Olivia found in her work, which was the 9 days sleep deprivation trial, was that obviously cognition is messed up very quickly with lack of sleep. And this is something that's been shown for many, many years, so it's nothing new. But I guess when you are sleep deprived, cognition is the first thing that goes. And then what she did, Olivia, she did train these people, these females, because they were all females. That was her area of interest in the gym. And she actually found that the amount they could lift across the 9 days were not that different from when they weren't sleep deprived. However, the quality of the lifting was drastically affected. And what I did next, because I had an interest in what was happening at the molecular level, I took these muscle biopsies and I'd look at the expression of about 20,000 genes at different time points and compared my various groups. And what I found is basically, to give you the simplest possible answer, exercise is good, sleep is bad. And everything positive that exercise will do to your muscle, sleep deprivation will remove from your muscle. So let's say a simple example is the activation of muscle protein synthesis, which is basically the one molecular event that is needed to help your muscle to grow, right? So resistance exercise is one of the most powerful ways to activate these pathways or this cascade of events in the muscle. So where we saw that the exercise sessions that we submitted our participants, sleep deprived and not sleep deprived too, had the ability to activate this muscle protein synthesis pathway, the moment you sleep deprived them, this ability was gone or drastically reduced. And there are evidences that this could be due to hormonal changes. So this is the big study where we actually sleep deprived people for 36 hours that indicated that, I think in this study, and the sex-specific findings were incidental, so we haven't really looked at the ovarian sex hormones, but I remember looking at testosterone, and we hypothesized that the drop of testosterone that came with sleep restriction or complete sleep deprivation in that stage, we hypothesized that this could be a contributor to the fact that the muscle is suddenly not able to produce more proteins and to grow anymore, even after an exercise session. And we also pinpoint the role of cortisol, which was much, much higher in those who were sleep deprived for so long.
Related to cortisol, loss of muscle, and sleep, where do you now sit in terms of practical advice when you've done the sleep deprivation studies? What advice do you give people who want healthy muscle as they age and live in the real world where we do? I'm doing my PhD. I slept 5 hours a night as I wrote up the thesis. So this is not uncommon. Now that you understand how sleep deprivation is affecting muscle protein synthesis and those pathways, what advice do you give for people who want healthy muscle and sleep?
Yeah, so again, I would exercise a bit of caution. We have very strong associations between lack of sleep and muscle protein synthesis. That's one of the things that is very hard. Again, cause and effect relationships are very hard to test experimentally. However, my students came up with a very nice figure where basically the message, as always, is simple. The more exercise, the better. The more sleep, the better.
Yeah, okay.
So there were people in my institute, for example, who looked at critically or chronically sleep-deprived population, which wasn't my case. So I worked with healthy participants who came to the lab with fairly healthy sleep patterns. But the moment you start looking at, for example, young parents or elite athletes is a very good example, or obviously the elderly people who tend to sleep less, you start to dab with these populations which are chronically sleep deprived. So I remember there was someone here in my institute who actually suggested a sleep extension as a possible remedy to sleep deprivation. Like, for example, if you had a player that had been playing games super late, adding an hour's sleep to their schedule the next morning could help recover some of these capabilities that had been lost. I think that napping is always, when possible, especially in the context of elite sports, napping is always a good advice where possible, especially in young athletes that might be dealing with school work and travels and training and all these things at the same time. But at the end of the day, I guess the best advice, and it's easier said than done, is to maintain a good sleep hygiene, which again may not be the same for everyone, but it will be very individual, and some people will be very happy with 6 hours and some people with 9 hours, and that's fine. And I also have a colleague in South Australia who is looking at, okay, if you cannot sleep because let's say you're a shift worker, would it be worthwhile prescribing you a very small exercise regime, which might just be stand up every half hour and go for a walk in the park or something like that, to actually prevent these side effects that might be muscle or metabolic or even cognitive in the long run?
Very interesting. Let's approach the ends now of our discussion, but two final comments, one related to the muscle protein synthesis. You've also done work in muscle disuse and the use of amino acids and proteins. Where's our current understanding at with the role of protein in rescuing muscle protein synthesis when it is being disused?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the research areas that have been very well researched. And I think we've got solid, robust results that we can infer causalities from. And this is mostly the work of a very, very good friend of mine who passed away 4 years ago, and his name was Professor Douglas Paddon-Jones. He was an Australian, but based at the University of Texas Medical Branch, and he's discovered pretty much everything in this area. So basically, I guess the muscle protein synthesis cascade can be activated by various ways, and one simple way to do it is to load bear, so basically to work your muscle against an external load, in other words, lifting weights or performing resistance training or any type of exercise, really, with different magnitudes resulting in different outcomes. Hormones also can activate muscle protein synthesis. So, for example, in cells, when you put testosterone in cells, it will activate the protein synthesis pathway, but then it becomes a bit controversial when it's done in vivo in participants. And again, we are coming back to these molecular details. The third way to do it is via dietary protein intake, because there are some amino acids, which are the building blocks of the proteins that we ingest, that actually have the capacity to very potently activate this muscle protein synthesis pathway, and one of them is leucine. So we have to keep in mind that some people just cannot exercise, and this is true especially in the elderly populations. So what can we do if, for example, an older person is bedridden for whatever reason, they broke a leg, they are being hospitalized, they're undergoing surgery, or they just have the flu? So the first thing we will notice is that when compared to a younger person, their muscle will atrophy at a much faster rate. But the other thing we will notice is that it will be harder to regain that muscle. So the research is very clear that resistance exercise should be a prime intervention, and it's even more potent when combined with the right nutritional intervention. And in that case, it would be something based on high quality, for example, leucine, high quality protein supplementation. And my friend Doug showed that by keeping a very balanced diet in terms of protein intake, and by balanced, I mean you should have proteins 3 times a day, not a heap load of protein at dinner and then have 0 protein at breakfast and lunch, was the best way to actually maintain muscle protein synthesis, especially in a state where your body tends to degrade muscle. That is typically when you're not able to perform any physical activity. And he also showed that in older but healthier patients, the combination of resistance exercise and protein intake was actually much more potent at activating muscle protein synthesis than previously thought, which means that we've been dabbling with that concept of anabolic resistance for a very long time. And the idea is that as you get older, your muscle might become less responsive to this external stimuli, which might tell your muscle, okay, it's time to grow, like resistance exercise, protein. And his work has shown that actually with the right amount of exercise combined with the right amount of protein at the right time and several times during the day, this is not entirely true, and there are ways to actually counteract this idea of anabolic resistance. So I think the message here is that to age for the muscle to age in a healthy way. Oh, let's put it a different way. Aging is not a death sentence. And there are many things that can be done, whether people can exercise or not. There are many things that can be done to maintain the muscle integrity, even past this stage of menopause for females and aging for males.
And do you have a recommended amount of protein?
This is well described. This is well described in the literature. When it comes to high quality protein intake, 30 grams of leucine, for example, which is this amino acid that I was talking about, is usually the prescribed amount. 3 times a day being much better than 190-gram intake. Like, for example, it's great to have a steak at night, but having a 400-gram steak is not going to make it better in terms of protein ingestion and absorption. And it's much better to have it like equally spread out across the day. And in where 15 grams, I think, is already enough to activate muscle protein synthesis in younger fellows. For the elderly, I believe last time I checked, 30 grams was still a recommended amount. And if there is a chance to combine it with exercise, it's even better.
So synergistic.
Yeah.
One final question for you. You've also done work in performance-enhancing drugs. Given that you're a hormone expert, you've looked at how hormones change and are associated with muscle quality and strength. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this wouldn't even really be a point of discussion, in that performance-enhancing drugs, anabolics, androgenic agents, they were the mainstay of males or some females in strength power sports. But now, with its ability to change physique and with designer drugs that can take out the androgenic components or make you more anabolic, we're now seeing a huge intake of taking performance enhancing drugs in women. So could you perhaps just outline what different options females have and what they're doing and what the downsides potentially are?
Yeah. So firstly, all females out there, if you're listening, not taking anabolic steroids or performance-enhancing drugs would always be my favorite option, because these have significant side effects that you may not want to experience. And while you might only see them on the short term, they are also very, very serious long-term side effects. So that's just my pre-warning public health message. Now, for the females who are taking performance-enhancing drugs, obviously there are a range of drugs to choose from. One thing that I find a bit baffling is that I don't think we've actually evolved much more in terms of what we've seen in the 80s and what we're seeing now, and that the good old androgenic steroids or anabolic steroids, such as testosterone, its metabolites, and its derivatives, are still front and center. And I am not aware of any any potent anabolic agent which will come without the masculinizing side effects or any other side effect. So what we see in the field is that it's still testosterone and the like that are mostly used by males and females equally in an attempt to purely increase their muscle mass and, as a consequence of training, then increase their muscle function. So to me, there are many, many issues to unpack. The first one being that we mostly, unless prescribed by a doctor, I would be always extremely wary of ordering anything online and just assuming that what it says on the label is what you're going to absorb orally, or even worse, to inject yourself. And there was a study from a guy when I was doing my PhD back in Lausanne in Switzerland, 15 years ago or more, who had ordered an enormous amount of various supplements and doping agents from the internet. And he had actually tested them in the anti-doping lab to figure out what was exactly in the substances. And it came to no surprise that it was nowhere near was advertised on the label. So I would be very wary of what is actually contained in the substances. Now, let's say you have a reliable dealer, or whatever you want to call it, who provides you with pure testosterone. There are enormous amounts of side effects, especially for females, and these are not well known. So we know of the broader muscle hypertrophy, jaw enlargement of some parts of the genitals, facial hair, deepening of the voice, etc., etc. And that's all very or mostly undesirable side effects for females. I think the main issue here is that, and what we found in the study that you're referring to, is that females do not know where to seek advice. Let's say they have made the decision, and that's their right to take performance enhancing agent for their lifestyle or for their performance at the gym or whatever the reason is. That's fine, but there is nowhere where they can actually seek their information from. So we found that online platforms, but also their coaches and their partners, which are mostly males, would be the one they would look at to seek information. And obviously the research is not out there, and what appears online on blogs, again, mostly relayed by males, physiological consequences and outcomes of testosterone injection or intake on the female body has not been described. And again, back to ethical concern. How do you actually do that in a group, in a cohort of participants? So yeah, there are studies who have done it. For example, I can think of one study in Scandinavia that's been published a few years back that actually has given testosterone to females in a very controlled condition and has recorded the side effects. Now, I think what the information that is found online is just unreliable or provided by males and not translatable to females, or we grossly overlook some of the side effects. And it's just about being very careful of what everyone is ready to do with their body. In a way, I would argue it's much safer to do it as a male.
Right. Yeah. And the dose differences, it would be very difficult for a female to get the dose right.
Yeah, because simply there's years and years and decades of trial and errors in males, whether we want it or not. So the data is available if we look for it, but that data just doesn't exist for females. And I think that's one of the highest dangers in these days and time is that women do not have anyone reliable to talk to or trustable to talk to who have experienced what they are hoping to experience and can actually share reliable information. And while I'm not in favor of performance enhancing drugs, this would just make the process much, much safer for everyone involved.
And not only do we have little information about the androgens, but the new designer drugs, the peptides, the selective androgen receptor modulators, there's so much less information. So even if you are considering it, not many people are actually measuring metrics other than blood pressure to see what is happening to hematocrit or measuring cardiac chamber size, which is very easily done.
You're absolutely right. And I think we have to remember that no drug has ever been designed for the purpose of doping or performance enhancing. So all of these drugs have been designed to actually treat real conditions, and they've been designed by real pharmaceutical companies. Now, are you talking about selective receptor androgen SRAM modulator? I've got a good example in mind where there was a drug which seemed promising but has been withdrawn from clinical trials at phase 2. And that was because too many side effects. That happens a lot. It actually happens to most drugs that would reach phase 2 clinical trial, right? So there is a reason why these drugs are withdrawn from clinical trials. It's not because the pharmaceutical company doesn't want to put them on the market. It's just because the regulatory bodies have deemed them not safe enough to be released to the market. And that's the main reason why people should just not take them. But unfortunately, we know there's a lot of black market involved. There's a lot of alternative drug factories in various countries where we could simply order the drugs from the internet. And I remember when I was doing my PhD on EPO back in the 2005 to 2010, we did that a lot. We actually ordered various EPO formulations from China and found all sorts of different things in these products. And it's very expensive as well. But to your point, no drug is ever designed for the sake of performance enhancing, which is why you will never find, even for a drug that has been released on the market, you will rarely find indications on the effect that you're actually looking for. For example, as you said, it might be a drug that is designed for heart failure and you will find cardiac outcomes, but it won't tell you what the effect on the muscle is because that is just not the point. And yes, repurposing drug is a great thing down the track, and it's helped many diseases to be cured along the years, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking of basically taking the drug out of this context and just assuming that it will have a desirable effect and taking it as performance enhancing without even thinking about the consequences.
Well, thank you for your time. I think everyone listening realizes that you have research expertise in a wide range of biological aspects of aging. So if we could just quickly summarize you're at a party, somebody finds out what you do, and they want to know how to get through and after menopause in the best possible condition for their brain and their muscle, as these are your areas. What would you tell them? What is the exercise advice, sleep advice that you would succinctly give?
Yeah, and let's go back to this idea of the female lifespan and menopausal transition, because this is mostly what I've been focusing all my efforts on in the last 5 years, which good success. And I'd like to say that I'm glad that while research funding is a bit dire in Australia, a lot of us are struggling, this area of sex differences, especially in the context of aging, seems to be a bit appealing to the funders, and this is really encouraging because I think we only start to recognize that females, they will live longer than males, but with a less healthy aging process, especially when it comes to skeletal muscles. So in as little as 10 years, but also at the horizon 2050, this country is going to have an issue with aging if we're not tackling the health span, which is a new word that basically means how long someone will remain in good health, as opposed to the lifespan, which means how long someone will just merely remain alive. So when it comes to females, or obviously the aging process, as pretty much everything else in biomedical research, and this is another little sidekick that I have, has been less researched than for males. And we've just created a national center to tackle this issue at the political and funding level. And this is very, very interesting other things that I'm doing in my free time. But we know less about female aging than we know about male aging, and that is true at the level of muscle physiology, bone physiology, and metabolism. And we know even less about this menopausal transition, which happens between grossly 45 to 65 years old. So what we have found with our studies is that obviously all these events that we see, a loss in muscle mass, a loss in muscle function, a loss in potentially muscle performance, are concurrent with this decrease in ovarian hormone levels that accompany menopause, and there are strong associations between hormonal declines and these various factors. As for cause and effect relationships, these still have to be researched further. Now, something I always say is that everyone is different and that a little bit doing something is always better than doing nothing. So you will find a lot of exercise programs online. And again, there's no one size fits all. Some people can exercise, some people enjoy exercise, some people hate exercise, right? So doing something is always better than doing nothing. During that menopausal transition, one of the very best things that a female can do is to actually keep active and, if possible, to lift a little bit of weight, because this is what will actually maintain her muscle mass, which, on my opinion, is the major predictor of future diseases. So if you had to choose between running 100 Ks a week or lifting weight, I would actually advise lifting weight. Even so, maintaining cardiovascular fitness is enormously important. But in the context of muscle aging, lifting some weights, pushing against external load is always a good advice. So maintaining a good sleep hygiene, a bit good nutritional hygiene in parallel with exercising where possible is always a good advice. And I'm not reinventing the wheel. We know all of this. And my research is just confirming things that we know and trying to understand mechanisms. But it's not gonna revolutionize the field of exercise. Also, when it comes to hormone replacement therapy, some women have reported extremely encouraging results when it comes to their muscle health or to their exercise performance or to their brain health. And I really encourage everyone to just try what works for them and talk to their doctor, whether it's a GP or gynecologist or an endocrinologist, to find out what is best for them. No two HRT the same and no two women are the same. So it will really depend on how everyone is feeling and is able to do. And at the end of the day, we should listen to our bodies and do what is best for us.
Thank you so much, Severine. This has been a real masterclass in biology of aging. Your work in your lab is doing really incredible work to expand our knowledge in this area. Where can people find more about the work that you're doing? I know I thoroughly enjoyed going through PubMed and looking at your history of your research. So where can people find more about you?
So I'm not very good at communicating my science, and I think I was very grateful for your invitation for that reason. This is the first time I do something like this. I do write a little bit for a lay audience in journals such as The Conversation and things like that. But the best way to find about myself and my research is just to Google my name. There's only one in Australia and one in the world, so you're not going to find someone else. And I would advise people who have the capacity to actually go back to the research papers and to ask questions if they do have questions, because one of my main issues with scientific communication, and as much as it's extremely important and I enjoy a good piece of scientific communication, the reality is always more complex that can be expressed in 800 words. And you might have found that during this podcast, I was extremely cautious with everything I put forward in terms of mechanisms, etc. And it's just because so much research has not been done, or there are so many multiple layers of stuff explaining a single result or a single observation or outcome variable that we can't just be too definitive about anything. So if you can read research paper, that's fantastic, because you will find the details and how complicated the whole reality is. But just go by name, and I also write for lay audiences and across various supports.
Thank you. I think that's a sign of a good scientist, in that the answers are detailed, complex, a lot of nuance there before advice is given. And I think a sign of somebody who's a little bit too flippant and definitive in their advice might be missing how complicated these things really are. So thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. I appreciate it too. Thank you.
Thanks, Severine. Thanks for tuning in to the Stronger with Time podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing this. And if you're ready to go deeper, the 9-week Science of Thriving course is available now. The link is in the show notes.